Why would the United States send some of the largest warships on Earth toward Iran and still be trying, at the same time, not to fire the first decisive shot? Before dawn in the Arabian Sea, when the steel of a flight deck still holds the night's cold and the smell of JP-5 hangs under the island like burned metal and salt, that question feels less like a headline and more like a riddle. Red lights glow across the deck. Yellow shirts move through the dark like signals in human form. And somewhere below, thousands of sailors wait inside a machine built for war. If you believe sea power matters most when it prevents a war before it begins, comment, "Hold the line," below. Because what this supercarrier buildup really signals is not simple aggression, and what it reveals about American strategy is far more unsettling than a rush to attack. The challenger in this story is not a single admiral or a single politician. It is a battlefield logic shaped by Iran's geography, its coastal missile belts, its fast attack craft, its drones, its proxy networks, and above all, its ability to turn a narrow body of water into a pressure chamber. Iran does not have to sink a carrier to change American behavior. It only has to make commanders think about mines in the Strait of Hormuz, anti-ship missiles launched from the coast or from islands, swarming small boats, deniable harassment of tankers, and the political effect of even a limited American loss. Analysts who study the Gulf have long argued that the inner waters there compress the battle space, reducing the distance, the warning time, and the tracking burden needed to threaten high-value ships. In that kind of environment, the simple presence of a supercarrier does not automatically mean the United States wants war. It often means Washington wants leverage without paying the price of immediate escalation. That is why the room in this story is so vast and so strange. It is a map room in Washington, a watch floor in Bahrain, a destroyer combat information center lit in dim blue, a tanker company boardroom in the Gulf, and a flight deck stretching more than 4 acres into black water. In October 2023, after Hamas attacked Israel, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin ordered the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group toward the eastern Mediterranean and then redirected the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower carrier strike group toward Central Command's area, explicitly saying the move would bolster regional deterrence, protect U.S. forces, and assist in Israel's defense. Almost a year later, in September 2024, Pentagon Press Secretary Pat Ryder said the United States was keeping the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group in the CENTCOM theater alongside additional fighters because the mission was to protect U.S. forces, defend Israel, and de-escalate through deterrence and diplomacy while preventing Iran and its proxies from widening the conflict. That is the important detail most people miss when they see multiple carrier decks on a map. The official language is not conquest, it is insurance, signaling, contingency, and the prevention of a larger fire. And yet, the carriers themselves do not look defensive. A Nimitz-class or Ford-class supercarrier is a floating contradiction, a city-sized airfield armored by escorts and driven by nuclear reactors, carrying strike fighters, electronic attack aircraft, airborne early warning planes, helicopters, missiles, and enough command and control capacity to reshape an entire theater. On the deck, nothing feels abstract. The catapult's steam, the non-skid is rough under boots, chains scrape metal, and the ocean air cuts through every layer of clothing long before sunrise. Sailors do not experience deterrence as a concept. They experience it as 0300 wake-ups, tension in the ready room, and the knowledge that everyone onshore believes this ship exists to hit something. That is precisely why its restraint matters. A weapon this visible becomes political theater the moment it arrives on station. The witnesses are everywhere in a crisis like this. They are Israeli planners, watching for Hezbollah escalation, Gulf monarchies measuring American resolve, tanker captains studying insurance premiums, Chinese buyers of Gulf oil watching whether shipping lanes stay open, and Iranian commanders asking a colder question, is this build-up the prelude to attack, or is it an attempt to avoid one? That last audience matters most. Deterrence is not a speech delivered to the public. It is a message constructed inside the mind of an adversary, and it works only if the other side believes both that you can escalate and that you would prefer not to. The Washington Institute put it plainly: carriers do not reliably deter every Iranian action, but they can alter Tehran's risk calculus, reassure partners, and provide forward contingency response. In other words, a supercarrier is not just a fist. It is also a stage, a shield, and a bargaining chip. That is where the tension begins to rise. Because if carriers are so powerful, why not push them directly into the Gulf and force Iran to back down? Why keep one in the Arabian Sea, another in the Eastern Mediterranean, and a wider lattice of destroyers, Patriots, THAAD batteries, fighters, drones, and amphibious ships spread across the region? The answer is almost painfully simple. The closer a supercarrier gets to the narrowest, most surveilled, most missile-saturated waters near Iran, the more it stops being a symbol of freedom of action and starts becoming a hostage to geometry. Iran's strategy in the Gulf has never depended on beating the US Navy ship for ship. It depends on using coastal access, tunnel-hardened missiles, small boats, and choke points to impose friction, uncertainty, and political cost. So the provocation is not a shouted insult, it is a strategic dare. Iran's challenge to carrier power is almost philosophical. Come closer if you want to prove dominance, but every mile inward reduces your margin for error and increases ours. That is why the loudest headlines can be misleading. A build-up looks like impatience to the public, but inside professional military circles, it can mean the opposite. It can mean Washington is assembling enough visible force that it does not have to use it immediately. It can mean the United States is trying to keep Iran guessing, calm nervous partners, protect shipping, and preserve response options without crossing the threshold into a war neither side can easily control. You can feel that logic most clearly in the seconds before a jet leaves the deck. At 4:17 local time, in that grey band before sunrise, when the sea turns from black to graphite, the flight deck crew moves with a precision that looks almost ceremonial. The pilot taxis forward, wings loaded, engines vibrating through the hull. In the first second after the aircraft is locked to the catapult, the deck feels less like a ship and more like a compressed spring. By the third second, the shooter is crouched and pointing, steam hisses, and every eye nearby is fixed on the same line of motion. Then, in the next heartbeat, the aircraft is gone, thrown into the humid air and vanishing into the dawn. From the outside, that launch is easy to misunderstand. A viewer imagines the sortie is racing toward Iranian targets. A map graphic on television makes it look like the war has already begun. But, in many of these crises, the first aircraft off the deck are not there to start the war the audience expects. They are there to extend radar coverage, escort ships, watch for missile launches, maintain combat air patrols, reassure allies, and prove that the carrier strike group can transition from posture to action without warning. In the 5th second after takeoff, the symbolic meaning of the jet diverges from its tactical function. Symbolically, it screams escalation. Tactically, it may be there to prevent escalation by making the costs of miscalculation unmistakable. That is the paradox at the heart of the supercarrier buildup. If Washington truly wanted the simplest route to a quick punitive strike, the buildup would look narrower and more disposable. Instead, carrier groups arrive with escorts, air defense reinforcements, amphibious forces, and overlapping command networks, because the United States is preparing for a spectrum of contingencies, most of which it would rather not trigger. In the first hour of a crisis, the carrier is a sensor node, an airfield, a deterrent signal, and a reserve of violence held in public view. By the third hour, destroyers may be repositioned to protect higher-value units, airborne early warning aircraft may be managing a larger picture, and regional partners may already be adjusting their own posture under the assumption that Washington has not abandoned them. By nightfall, if no strike has occurred, that absence is not weakness. It may be the strategy. What happens next is where most casual observers lose the plot. They wait for the dramatic strike montage, the cruise missiles, the bomb damage assessment, the obvious cinematic payoff. But the real strategic execution often happens in the decision not to spend the carrier's most visible political capital too early. The Washington Institute noted that decades of carrier presence did not reliably stop Iranian-linked attacks, which means the carrier's value is not magical deterrence. Its value is that it changes the menu. It gives Washington more ways to respond, more ways to hold the line, more ways to protect partners, and more ways to punish if necessary without committing instantly to the largest option. And there is another reason for caution. One professional navies never ignore. In the Persian Gulf, the water is relatively shallow, the distances are short, the shoreline is hostile, and the geometry favors the defender. War on the Rocks described the Gulf as a compressed battle space where geography substitutes for much of the surveillance burden Iran would face in the open ocean. The Strauss Center has highlighted the same basic toolkit for years. Shore-based anti-ship cruise missiles, more than 100 small boats, missile boats, naval special warfare forces, island positions, and the standing ambition to threaten the Strait of Hormuz. A supercarrier thrives on reach. Iran's littoral strategy thrives on shrinking that reach into a narrow, nervous corridor. That is why the smartest use of a carrier can look, to the untrained eye, like hesitation. The ship holds farther out. The escorts absorb more of the visible risk. The air wing flies from range. Submarines, land-based aircraft, regional bases, missile defense batteries, and partner forces all become part of a wider system designed to keep the carrier from becoming the easiest target on the board. In the first day of a surge, viewers see accumulation. By the second day, analysts begin to notice spacing. By the third day, the pattern becomes clear. The buildup is not crowding into the kill box. It is forming a ring around it. Once you see that, the teaching moment arrives. The lesson is not that carriers are obsolete. It is that their greatest power in a crisis with Iran may lie in disciplined distance rather than theatrical proximity. During prior surges, Pentagon language consistently emphasized deterrence, force protection, defense of partners, and readiness for contingencies. That wording matters because it reflects how American power is actually managed at the threshold of regional war. A supercarrier is too valuable to use as a prop in somebody else's trap. It becomes most effective when it forces Iran to contemplate American escalation without giving Iran the clean, close target set it would prefer. There is wisdom in that restraint, and it is more technical than moral. Carriers are magnificent at generating sustained air power, command presence, and flexible response. But they are not designed to erase geography. They cannot make chokepoints wide. They cannot make missile salvos politically irrelevant. They cannot turn a regional conflict into a sterile demonstration. CSIS warned that even overwhelming American maritime capability runs into strategic limits in the Strait of Hormuz because the contest becomes one of endurance, leverage, cost, and political tolerance. That is why the buildup signals restraint. It acknowledges that the first objective is not to prove the carrier can strike. It is to prevent Iran from turning America's most visible symbol of power into the opening scene of a wider crisis. Seen this way, the carrier strike group becomes a teacher of systems logic. The escorts teach that the carrier is never alone. The spacing teaches that range is protection. The constant sorties teach that readiness can be visible without becoming reckless. The deployment of THAAD, Patriots, fighters, amphibious groups, and additional forces on prepare-to-deploy orders teaches something even more important. Modern deterrence is layered, not singular. The supercarrier is the centerpiece people remember, but the restraint comes from the entire architecture built around it. Then the ego dissolves, not of a man, but of a theory. The theory says more carriers automatically mean more aggression. The evidence says something subtler. Sometimes more carriers mean Washington is buying time, widening options, reassuring allies, and warning Iran not to gamble on a limited strike, a proxy escalation, or a maritime provocation. Sometimes the buildup exists precisely because policymakers know a premature offensive would hand Iran the one thing it wants most. A conflict compressed into the waters and timelines where American advantages become politically expensive to use. That does not make carriers passive, it makes them disciplined. The longer-term impact of this logic is already visible across naval planning. Every crisis around Iran pushes the United States toward a more distributed posture, where the carrier remains central but no longer stands as the only instrument that matters. Destroyers with air defense missions, submarines operating quietly, land-based fighters, missile shields, drones, maritime surveillance coalitions, and regional partnerships increasingly do the slow, daily work of denial. The Washington Institute even argued that lighter and more actively employed forces, backed by a credible willingness to act, may shape Iranian behavior more sustainably than endless back-to-back supercarrier deployments alone. In that sense, the carrier buildup around Iran has been teaching the Navy a harsh lesson about its own legend. Presence matters, but geometry still rules. 5 years from now, naval officers may look back on these deployments not as proof that the age of the carrier is ending, but as proof that the age of solitary symbols is over. The carrier still concentrates power better than almost any warship ever built. What has changed is the environment around it. Iran's littoral defenses, the precedent of missile and drone coercion, and the economic sensitivity of the Strait of Hormuz all mean that major naval power must now be practiced with more patience than spectacle. The legacy of these standoffs may not be a famous strike package or a dramatic sinking. It may be the normalization of a harder truth. The stronger your platform, the more carefully you must choose the moment not to use it. And 50 years from now, if naval historians are honest, they may say the real image that defined this era was not a bomb leaving a pylon. It was a supercarrier holding just far enough away. It was the sight of jets launching into a dark morning, not to begin the war the public expected, but to keep the map from tipping into something worse. It was the recognition that, in the missile age, mastery is not measured only by the ability to strike first. It is measured by the ability to remain terrifyingly capable while refusing the enemy's preferred fight. The lesson is clear. Power and restraint are not opposites at sea. In the most dangerous waters, they become the same discipline viewed from different angles. A supercarrier buildup near Iran signals that the United States is ready for violence, but determined not to spend its greatest advantages in the narrowest possible arena unless it must. That lesson applies well beyond naval warfare. In strategy, in politics, in any contest of ego and leverage, the side that can do the most damage is not always the side that is winning. Sometimes the side truly in control is the one that can make everyone feel the weight of force while still choosing the harder art of not using it too soon. And that is why the flight deck at dawn matters so much. The roar, the steam, the salt, the shudder underfoot, the red glow on steel, all of it seems to announce that history is about to explode. Yet sometimes, the deeper story is the one you do not see. The strike that does not launch, the line that is not crossed, the war that remains, for one more day, on the far side of the horizon. But if you think this is the most dangerous paradox in carrier warfare, wait until you see what happens when drones, submarines, and land-based missiles begin stripping away the carrier's protective distance altogether.